morning, everyone, or should I say good afternoon or good evening, whichever is appropriate for you. And welcome to our webinar today, Wellbeing Strategies for Leaders and School Communities. I'm Lauren Bridge, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Officer of the Alliance of Girls' Schools Australasia. So thank you for taking time to join us for this really important and very timely conversation on wellbeing. Just earlier this month, the World Health Organization released some data showing that COVID had triggered a 25% increase in the prevalence of anxiety and depression worldwide. And while we probably don't need to know that from the World Health Organizations, we can feel it in our own personal connections and schools. It's a pretty staggering figure. And when we do see statistics that are as alarming as this, it's fortunate that we have access to the work of people like Adam Fraser and Jo Thurbon, and their work is shining a light on the wellbeing in schools and providing strategies for schools to implement best practice school-wide wellbeing programs. So Adam Fraser, if you don't know, is the founder of the Flourish movement. And this is a program that is designed specifically for school principals to help principals to improve their own wellbeing, their own work-life balance and leadership effectiveness. And the program has just won a global award from the Academy of Management for Best Action Research Project. So kudos to you, Adam, for that one. And its sibling program, Flourish for Schools, is a toolkit for school leaders to bring many of those same benefits from the principals program back to their schools for their staff. And Jo Thurbon is the founder of Educator Impact. Educator Impact is a long-term partner of the Alliance, and their Pulse program helps schools to understand and support the wellbeing of both students and staff through regular check-ins that provide a basis for proactive real-time interventions. And Pulse has been used to really great success in hundreds of schools around the world, including many Alliance member schools. So both Flourish and Pulse are data-driven programs, and their findings are rigorously tested, and Adam and Jo are going to share some of those findings in this session. But before I do give the screen to Jo and Adam, if you do have questions for them, there's going to be some time at the end of the session for those. And if you can just use the Q&A button in the menu bar, so not the chat button, but the Q&A button, and submit your questions there. So now let me very warmly welcome Jo Thurbon and Adam Fraser.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It's a real pleasure to be here. We've been working with the Alliance, as Lauren said, for a long time now. And it's no surprise to us that some of the very first schools to start using Pulse were, in fact, Alliance members. So we're really glad to be here. So I guess we'll start maybe with a little bit about me, and then I'll hand over to Adam as well. I'm Jo. This is one of my favorite photos of me, not because I think it's a great photo, but it was also taken by my daughter for her Year 7 photography elective. And so it catches me in my very happy place, which is surfing. Well, I'm not surfing there, obviously. Well, it would be pretty disastrous, but that's where my real happy place is. I only know how to surf because I made the choice about 15 years ago to move to a place where I'll be closer to my daughter's schools. So I'll be able to be involved in taking them to school. I think that's super important. But if I look a little bit further back, I guess my career has always been in applying my own skills. I'm trained as an artificial intelligence engineer. Is to try to turn those skills into social impact. So I've been really lucky to work with world-class researchers in climate change and in health and medical research and in ecology. And now working with many amazing researchers, including Adam, around trying to help schools become a better place to teach and learn. So that's me.
Excellent. Thank you, Jo. I've just realized your job description, artificial intelligence engineer, is far cooler than mine. But since you started on a personal level, I'll do the same thing. So I am married to a woman that is far brighter than I am. I have 2 daughters who have me completely wrapped around their little finger, and a dog, Tilly, who routinely outwits me. So that's me personally. Professionally, what our company does is we conduct large scale research projects and then we design interventions off the back of them. So one of the ones we've completed recently is we did a study across Australia and New Zealand around the mental health and wellbeing of financial advisors. And now we're working with regulators and the associations to address those issues that we found. But obviously today, what I'm talking about is a project we've been doing for the last 6 years, which is the Flourish movement. Now, how I got involved in this space is I was contacted by a group of principals on the New South Wales South Coast, and they had a network meeting and they were really struggling with their wellbeing, and the department had announced all these sweeping changes to, the finance systems, and 4 of the principals literally stood up and walked outside in tears and just said, I just don't know if I can take any more change. And one of the principals down there, a guy called Greg Wells, walked out and said, the cavalry's not coming. Like, we're waiting for the department to come to our rescue and solve our well-being. And he said, it's just not going to happen. And those principals had seen me present at a conference, and they said, well, why don't we talk to Adam Fraser about what he could design? So I went down there, I sat with them, I listened to their challenges. I then brought Deakin University on board, because what they talked about is that the role had changed significantly, but they found it hard to articulate how it had changed. So what we started to do was a deep study of school leaders. So it wasn't just a survey. We got them to do a 10-day diary study, so we understood where their time went, how they felt at different points of the day, what stressed them, what challenged them. We also did a detailed interview and a survey. From that, we also started to look at, well, what makes a high-performing school leader? And then what we did is sat down together as a group and designed the Flourish Movement program. It was something that was co-designed between us and the principals. So one of the reasons why it's been successful, and one of the reasons why it won an award, is that co-design. We designed it with the people who sit in the chair. And our focus was not only how do we improve school leaders' quality of life, but how do we then influence student outcomes, but also how do we leave a more positive job legacy for that role of being a principal. Now, in terms of what we focused on is 4 main things. So the first part of the program focuses on recovery. This is all about well-being. This is about how do I manage the stress of the role? How do I prevent burnout? The second part is very much about how do they live above the chaos. One thing we found about school leaders, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is just how chaotic that environment is, how many interruptions, how many stakeholders they have. So we looked at how do they work in a way where they are more focused and more present, but also get less interruptions. The third thing is that obviously the job can be very stressful. And this results in high levels of negative thoughts and emotions. And what we're looking at is how do they manage those thoughts and emotions so it doesn't derail their behavior or affect their performance in the role. And then lastly, we look at what do they want to stand for as a leader? What contribution do they make? And most importantly, how do they have to act on a day-to-day basis to do that? One of the other things we do is also look at behavior change on a really deep level. So in each workshop, they do very clear action plans. They get a buddy that they talk with weekly throughout the program, another school leader. We send them videos and articles to remind them of the principles we talk about in the program, as well as a social media group where they come together and connect. And as Lauren said, we won a global award from the Academy of Management for this program. Now, one thing I will say about it is that it is a program that they go through, but it's also a research project. And we've got one of the most detailed data sets on principal wellbeing anywhere in the world. And it's a real mix of different regions in Australia, as well as different types of schools. But also, as Lauren said, we were running Flourish for about 3 years, and principals kept saying to us, how do we take this stuff back to our school? Like, my staff need this. And after this constant feedback, we designed a version for school staff. So obviously it's very different because the focus of a leader is quite different to the focus of a teacher or an admin person within the school. And we cover the same things, but it's just very much tailored to suit teachers and admin, well, all of school staff. So we still within it do research so you can benchmark your school against other schools. It's an online program that the school do together as a group. It has diagnostics, action plans, the whole bit. So these are the two programs that we work on in schools, and also this is the type of research that we've done. So Joe, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about like what the work that you do in Pulse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as this, I guess, is the precursor, what Adam and I are talking about now in terms of what it is that we do, so that when we get to the point of saying, well, these are the insights we'd like to share, I guess you kind of know where they come from. If I was to try to describe EI's philosophy, it's really around the importance of small steps. Now, I'm a researcher by background, and so, you know, I obviously know that some of the biggest changes in schools over the last 50 years have been around what I've seen called the assessment revolution. So the movements from summative to formative assessment, right? And so, you know, if I'm aware that I am in a webinar to a bunch of teachers and professional educators, so I don't want to over egg this. But if you think about academic outcomes, old academic outcomes, it makes perfect sense later. It makes perfect sense in retrospect to think that, well, the thing that we're trying to measure, those academic outcomes, we can also use that data, if we can collect it regularly enough, to steer the learning process. And it came as no surprise to me as a machine learning person, where your ability to build an artificially intelligent thing lives or dies on the quality of the data. So everyone sort of has this intuitive understanding that it's really hard to make a big change in one step. You have to make it in a series of small steps. And that was identified by, you know, Scriven and Bloom in the 1960s, and then Black and Willem in the late 1990s. And it's something that schools are really good at from an academic perspective. But if you think about it from the rest of the school's perspective, all those non-academic outcomes, that's what EI's goal is to bring that same change in intentional stance that helps so well in terms of academic outcomes and apply it to all the other parts of the school. And so what we built was Pulse. And Pulse, on the next slide, is a tool that is designed to help schools face three very particular challenges. We don't do everything, but the three particular challenges that we're trying to help schools with are these ones. The first is that overwhelmingly, students don't tend to reach out for help until they're feeling really, really bad. So students often leave help later than optimal, leave help seeking until later than optimal. So we want to help students reach out earlier. The second thing that we help with is that for teachers in the classroom who look after 30 or 60 or most schools have some sort of pastoral care program, and most teachers have 20 to 30 odd students who are kind of theirs to look after. But if you talk to them about it, their ability to find a couple of minutes on their own with each student, it takes months to get around that cycle of students. And so what we want to do is put in the hands of those teachers the data that helps them say, this week, I know I can only get to 3 or 4 students. I really want to prioritize those conversations with these particular students this week. So we help target that activity of teachers, so students, teachers, and for school leadership, the biggest challenge that we help with is that it's really hard to work out what it's like to be at school from the student's perspective. And if you look at the tools that they've got, tools that you have, the most ubiquitous one is an annual or semi-annual survey. And they're quite useful and they give you some good data, but they are really the analog of summative assessment. They're often, you will build an initiative based on last year's data and measure it with next year's data. And across 3 years, half of your school has graduated. So it's really hard to collect data on a cadence that's regular enough to make that transformation into small steps. We know that culture change happens downhill. We know that it took years and years and years and years to roll out a formative assessment because the tooling needs to catch up. And we provide that tooling for these non-academic outcomes. I'd like to finish it. So that's what we do. And I'm going to be presenting I'm going to be presenting some of the outcomes that we found when we built this system and rolled it out at schools. So the most important thing to remember is that instead of getting data annually, we're putting this information in front of students and therefore in front of staff on a weekly basis. So it's worth considering. At first blush, when I listened to Adam describe in detail what the Flourish movement does, and I listened to myself do in some detail what we do, it seems that they're quite different. But I want to just leave you with the story that made it really obvious to me that Adam and I should start working together, and pretty much the reason that we did. Now, this is a picture of an aeroplane. If you look really closely inside, it's powered by a guy on a bike. And it's called the Gossamer Albatross. Now, the story behind this aeroplane I find fascinating. I'm going to run through it really quickly. In 1959, there's an industrialist, British industrialist called Henry Kremer, and he launched a prize worth about $1 million in today's money for the first team who could effectively send a bike over the English Channel. And so they had to build a plane that was human powered and could cross the English Channel. That prize was launched 2 years before Kennedy announced the lunar program. So fast forward 10 years, NASA has landed on the moon 6 times, put 11 different people on the moon, and no one's even left the French coast yet. No one's managed to get even vaguely close to sending a plane across. These are super talented aeronautical engineers. It was a really famous prize. They're all trying to do it, all just failing. Fast forward another 8 years, and there was an American aeronautical engineer called Paul McCready, and he totally flipped the game. This is his plane, by the way. He built the Gossamer Albatross. He built it 2 years after starting. So the rest of the world had spent about 20 years trying to cross the English Channel. He did it within, I think, 18 months of starting. And his insight was you should not try to build the best plane you can. Not the toughest one, not the lightest one, not the fastest one, not the one with the best lift. What you should do is build a plane that's really easy to reassemble after it crashes. That insight, if you think about the cadence that he could build his next plane on, in the time that the competitors' teams would have one test flight, he would have hundreds. What's the difference between formative and summative assessment in a nutshell? He won the well, I don't know what it was in then days. He got the $1 million prize just a really short time after trying, and the only thing he was better at was measuring. And so if I think about what makes Adam such a great partner to us, and we use the Flourish framework inside our staff program, the reason that Adam and I work well together is because we both have the same attitude towards data, which is if you don't have good data, you're not taking it seriously. And so that's the reason that we, from my perspective, that's the reason that we came together. Adam, I might hand over to you to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, actually, Joe, it's really interesting hearing you talk about that and the importance of data. And what we're going to go into now is some of the things we've learned about educators. And what we found with the data that we gained from Deakin University, we found that in terms of well-being or the prevention of burnout, in many ways, educators had been barking up the wrong tree. So let me just give you one of the things. We measure various psychological constructs when we do Flourish, like a whole myriad. You know, it's the number of data points is huge. But what we discovered is that educators have the highest levels of resilience that we've ever measured. And we're comparing you to partners in law firm, partners in professional services like PwC, bank executives, paramedics even. Educators' level of resilience is higher than all those groups. And when we first entered this space, whenever the well-being conversation would come up, it would turn into a resilience program, like conversation, meaning a lot of people said, particularly people in the department, that, well, principals need to learn to be more resilient. So what our data showed is you guys need resilience like you need a hole in the head. As I said before, your scores are off the charts. I mean, think about most educators, half their arm could be hanging off and they'd still show up to work. Like what we discovered in our data, and feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to tell me how this makes you feel. But what we discovered is your resilience was off the charts. You don't have a resilience problem, you have a recovery problem. So what we found is the thing that puts you at most risk of well-being, mental health, disengagement, likelihood to leave the role, was that you don't practice recovery. And what happens is the pressure of the role accumulates. So, I mean, sorry to put up a graph, but if you look at this orange line, this measures recovery activities. And this is anything that helps you deal with the stress of the role. Now, one is doing nothing. And what we found is that most educators were just above one. Like, they're just simply not taking the time to, after a stressful event or after a hard day, to actually support themselves and put stuff back in so that they can keep giving. And as I said before, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to talk about, well, how does that sit with you? But Joe, the reason I kind of brought that up is you talk about the importance of data. And what we found is that whenever the wellbeing conversation came up, it turned into, let's give them a resilience program to make them stronger and make them tougher. And really it was, well, how do we make them just handle more stuff that we put on them? And what we showed is you need the complete opposite. You need more self-care, more recovery. Look, one of the other things that we also discovered that was quite fascinating is that the issue for educators is not too much stress. Now, before you start like hurling abuse at me in the Q&A, let me explain this. So what we asked educators to do is rate their level of stress from 1 to 5. And across hundreds and hundreds of educators, they rated it around 3.7, which is moderate to high. And this was one of the most important designs of Flourish, is we then looked at, well, how did you relate it in the moment in the diary study? So this is retrospective. You're sitting there, we ask you a question to think about your role as a whole and how much stress you experience. But then when we ask you in the moment, and this is diary study. So in the diary study, we look at how energy, mood changes over a day, as well as stress. And what educators rated is that their stress levels were just above 2, which is low. And when we looked at this, the reason is that educators' perception, so the job is so stressful and relentless that their perception of stress has been warped. That literally they go through something and go, like, what would crush the average person? An educator goes, that's just a Thursday. So what we focused on within Flourish is looking at, when you go through something stressful, you often kind of go, oh, okay, dust yourself off. What's the next thing I move into? And rather than practicing recovery or self-care or getting support around it, it's just like, batter up, what's coming at me next? And these two things show that huge accumulation of stress and pressure and workload is the thing that really robs you of well-being and is a thing that really starts to drive those levels of burnout. And Joe, like, even, I'll get you to weigh in on this. What we found is that by taking proper data, it totally changed our approach, but it also showed that what had been done up till there wasn't needed. It was actually exacerbating the problem. And when we had this data, we could start to go, well, actually, no, here's the focus. I don't know whether you want to weigh in on that or just want me to.
Oh, yeah, look, I'll tell a story a little bit later around exactly that happening, and even after you get the data, sometimes people's interpretation of the data can be wrong as well. It's just so important to keep on going back to the source. And that sort of analogously to, well, we asked up front and then we did diary study.
Yeah.
We see that happen at schools about, well, we got the pulse data and then we had a conversation. And
yeah.
the data's not the gold standard, but after the conversation, you wouldn't have had the conversation if you didn't have the data. So it's just you just got to sort of internalize the fact that you've got to keep learning.
Yeah. Okay. Like, I mean, what we also looked at is what are some of the things that drive this? And one of the biggest drivers of a lack of self-care is that mindset of educators. I look after everyone else, and if there's some time or something left over, I might do something for myself. And I mean, this is rampant. It is so, common amongst educators, is because of that. Like, that meaning and purpose serves you, but it's also that double-edged sword where it kind of comes back to bite you. So one of the things we've really focused on in Flourish, and this was fascinating, is that when educators hear this, they go, all right, I've got to get rid of the guilt and then I'll start looking after myself. But what we've been focusing on in Flourish is that guilt is so deep and entrenched. It's creating the capacity to feel the guilt, but still do the self-care activity and the behavior. And once again, it's a nuance, but it's very different, because most educators go, all right, when I stop feeling guilty about doing things for myself, then I'll start to take care of myself. But that guilt just doesn't shift and doesn't go away. So it's, how do I feel guilty about doing it, but still do the constructive behavior? Look, one of the other things we also discovered, and this data here is just school leaders, so deputies, assistant, like principals. And what we discovered is that the average school leader is interrupted 57 times a day. Now, that averages out to be about 1 every 7 to 8 minutes. So every 7 to 8 minutes, there's an interruption that totally stops what you're doing and you go off into a whole different tangent. And one of the things we also did with school leaders is mapped how many tasks they move between in a day. Now, what we found is that, once again, we're comparing you to all sorts of different groups. This is the broadest role we have ever come across, in terms of you wear so many different hats in a day. Now, the complexity of that is tiring enough. But look at that pie chart and overlay 57 interruptions. And one of the reasons why school leaders are tired and burnt out and overwhelmed is just the cognitive load of those two things combined is extraordinarily high. Gosh, actually, there is good news coming down the track. We'll talk about the fact that we see dramatic changes in this, but you're probably sitting there going, is this the motivational part of this webinar? But yeah, and just here's probably like one of the things, not only do we measure what's going on for them, but we measure the effectiveness of the program. We're constantly doing that. And we use Deakin University to be at arm's length from the research, because we have a commercial interest in this thing having a good impact. So to remove bias, we get a completely independent body to measure the outcomes. So we're constantly exploring, why does this thing work? And one of the biggest ones is it builds a really strong community. And what allows this to work is if you put a bunch of school leaders in the room, have really authentic, deep, vulnerable conversations, they start to support each other, they give each other permission, but also the connection that is built is extraordinary. And some groups have started to take it on where before the workshop, they'll get together and do something. In this top right-hand corner, we have the woman with, I was about to say the woman with the sunglasses, but the woman with the blonde hair at the top right, during one of the workshops, stood up. She was so brave and just went, hey, I just got to tell you, my biggest challenge is I'm lonely. She said, not lonely in life, but I'm professionally lonely. Yeah, I've moved schools. I don't have a network around me. I've just got no one to call and talk to about the challenges. And 3 other principals in the group just went, I feel exactly the same. So they formed a little group called the Wednesday Walkers. So Wednesday afternoon, they commit to each other that they're going to leave school on time. They go for a walk in nature and then they'll have dinner together. And what they talk about is that's the time where they ask advice, talk about challenges. So they said not only are they being physically active in nature, which is incredibly important for your mental health and your brain, but that collegial support. And what we also do in the program is each person gets a buddy that they talk to on a weekly basis to keep them accountable for doing the things that they said they're going to do in their action plans. But what we've also seen is it starts to become, they talk about Flourish and then they go, actually, while I've got you on the phone, I just want to have a conversation about this challenge I have with a parent. Can I get your advice? And what it starts to be is this coaching relationship. And we just did the sustainability that we'll talk about a little bit later, but 65% of all people who have gone through Flourish still talk to their buddy on a weekly basis, even 5 years after they've finished the program. And this collegial support is absolutely vital. What people say is the greatest thing this program gives them is that support, that connection. I'm starting to have these deep conversations with the people, with my colleagues. And one thing that actually excites me about the Alliance is the fact that you already have this great connection where you come together and support each other and share innovation and ideas. What I sitting here watching this, start to think about, well, do I tap into that network enough? Like, could I do more? Could I collaborate more, or start to get ideas from other people within the Alliance to really help me support and flourish in this role? So just to wrap up before I hand back to you, Joe, the other thing about Flourish for Schools is that it achieves this similar connection, because what we're doing as a school group is talking about our well-being, talking about how do we minimize interruptions, talking about meaning and purpose. What a lot of school principals have said is the conversations I have in this program are conversations I've wanted to have for years, but I haven't known how to start them. And so not only with this program is there content, but it's also doing it together as a group and having these rich conversations is part of the value as well. So one thing we talked about, Joe, was giving people tangible things to walk away with. And obviously you get a copy of these slides, but start to think about that resilience versus recovery piece. Like, where do you sit? Are you too biased in one way? How much recovery do you do? Also, after stressful events, do I spend time either debriefing or practicing self-care or doing something to nurture myself, particularly if it's been a highly volatile interaction? The third thing is, don't wait for the guilt to go before you practice self-care, because you're going to be waiting a really long time. And that even though you feel guilty about doing these things, still doing them, because they will sustain your career. They'll allow you to be a better leader. Be mindful of the number of interruptions that you have in a day and how you can start to minimize them, just because of the huge load it puts on our cognition. And then lastly, start to think about, as a member of this Alliance, do I tap into that enough? How could I leverage that more to improve my performance? So there's some of the things that we learned and some of the things I'd encourage you to do as an educator. I know we've got different roles watching this, but start to think about, how could I implement some of these things? So Joe, back to you about what you've learned from your research.
Absolutely. But before you move on, I just want to say I relate to some of this really quite recently. So my older daughter has a dog, and one of my great challenges was that I walk the dog, and it has been that way for a long time. And this year she started walking the dog, and at first I was, oh, this is terrific. She's taking responsibility, all these good things. And then after about a fortnight, I went, that's my recovery time. I didn't realize it at the time.
That's your what?
That's my recovery time.
Oh, so right. Yeah, cool.
That was the moment. I didn't realize I was doing it until I stopped doing it. Yeah. That was the time that I would just mull through what was happening in the day. I didn't have to do anything. I couldn't do anything. And so it was, a really interesting moment where I'd had this little recovery thing taken away accidentally. In fact, I was glad. And then I realized it was missing. Yeah.
And Joe, like, one of the things we talk about in day one is the concept of the third space, and how do educators transition from work mode to home mode, and how do they do that in a way where I can connect with the people that mean the most to me, but also how do I disconnect so my brain starts to calm down and it's not running at a million miles? But start walking the dog is my advice to you. Yep.
Turns out it's great. Okay, so look, just in that spirit, I guess I wanted to share the 4 big things that we learned. And I think each of them has an interesting takeaway in terms of, if you're going to embark on a change in the way the school supports wellbeing, which really is a cultural change, then what are the 4 things that you really have to know? And they're not surprising things, but the way that they pan out is what surprised me. So the first is the power of habit. Culture change is like any other change in an organization. It happens downhill. So the goal is you have to make the goal state easier than the present state. And that will look like tooling. It will make, it will look like making it easier to do the things because you've got some sort of support. It will also making it easier because you make people do it every now and then. So you've got to put things in people's way. But making things just feel like part of the culture, part of the habit, is probably the most important thing that I would suggest. It's not obvious that you should be thinking of it from a habit point of view, but in retrospect, it will feel like you can't imagine any other way to do it. Really tightly connected to that is when we debrief with principals and head counselors or school psychologists around the leadership of this program, it's not another thing for them to do necessarily. It's not, they don't have to do the heavy lifting, but they do have to do the heavy legitimizing. And what I mean by that is that you have to open up avenues and spaces in the school that you sanction as a leader as a thing that is valid to spend time on in the school. And from Pulse's perspective, that's saying actually there's a little bit of time that we carve out into the weekly cadence that where everyone checks in. So it fixes a habit issue and it also fixes a legitimacy issue. But it's not only about Pulse. If it's about really all of the initiatives that you do, you think about it from a habit perspective and you think about it from a legitimacy perspective. It's really important to have a leader who's got agency and responsibility for those things, but it's not the agency and the responsibility that drives it, it's the legitimizing behavior. So that was the second thing that we found really interesting. The third one, I did about 20 years ago, roughly, I did the Lifeline telephone counselling course, and I was a telephone counsellor up until we had kids. And then the overnights were impossible. But the thing that they taught us there, and they don't use these words specifically, but the way that we think about it is that people reach out for help when the fear of reaching out is overtaken by the sort of badness of the situation. So the way that we talk about it in EI is students will reach out for help when they feel sad enough and safe enough. But enough is really related to each other. So if you feel really bad, you don't have to feel quite so safe to reach out. But if you want to encourage, and remember I said at the very start, if you want to encourage students to reach out earlier, then you've got to provide an avenue to make that safe. And safe is not just about the physical aspects of it. It's about the familiarity with something. So when we talk to students about why didn't you go and see the counsellor earlier, they say, well, and one principal put it better than I ever could. They see it as a brave walk because people know they're going to the counsellor's office. Why didn't you reach out to Lifeline or to Kids Helpline? And the reason is it's totally unfamiliar. I don't know what was going to happen. And so I wait. And so you'll see this comes back to why habit is so important as well. If there's something in the student's way, then they will initiate help-seeking behaviour when that feels like a natural part of the school. We've had students who have never checked in on Pulse. It's optional, who have never checked in on a weekly cadence until the time they checked in to reach out for help. Something like 25% of the students who reach out for help, it's the first interaction they've had with the program. So safety is really important. And building a culture where we talk about wellbeing and where there's tools in place and where it's legitimized and where it's a habit just feels safer to the students. And the last thing I want to talk about is data. So it's really easy to say, well, we're good at data, we collect lots, right? And the takeaway for me is it's not about the amount of data that you take. It is about what you collect, although it turns out that's secondary importance. It turns out that the crucial thing that we didn't really have internalized until we talked with schools was it's also about making it easy to collect, so you can collect it regularly, but that's only a third of the game. The second thing it has to do is it has to be easy to interpret. And so, I know the New South Wales public school system users Tell Them From Me. And I also know from talking to principals and that many of the Tell Them From Me reports that have come 6 months after the data was collected just get put into the top shelf because no one can understand them. But so what's really important is that you present the data, you collect the data so it's easy, you collect it with the interpretation in mind, but the most important thing is that the people who you want to collect, who you want to act on the data, have the agency to act on the data. And that means that small steps have to be permissible And that's the circle, right? Back to habit. We get data regularly. We're collecting it often. It's easy to act on. And what you can build is a new culture where, and I promise you, teachers will act on the data if you make it easy. So we've seen teachers, we've debriefed with teachers who have said, I thought this was going to just be another thing and more work for me to do. Actually, it's removed the amount of work for me to do. And it's because we make it easy to collect data. We collect the kinds of data that's easy to interpret. And the school puts the stuff in place that gives teachers the agency to act. So that's what we've learned. What I wanted to do was close off with just a really brief description of the impact that this has had at various schools. So the impact is as follows. We've got about 130, roughly 130 people, 130,000 people using Pulse. It's split between staff and students. About 10,000 of those people are staff using Pulse, also checking in. They sit in the classroom with their students and they say, hey students, it's time for you to check in on your wellbeing. I'm going to do that too. And then the leadership gets the school data and the staff data and the student data at the same time. The reason we've been growing pretty quickly is that schools who do it in year one come back and do it in year two. About 95% of the schools who have tried it, keep trying it. So that's why we think it works. Second thing is, and this is, but look, I'm an engineer, right? I'm not a super emotional guy. But this is the bit that I found really challenging. This is the bit where I found some of my limits. So we've connected about 5,000 students with help. And a lot of that help is really early in the process. And it's about friendship issues and it's about struggling a bit with things that teachers can resolve. A lot of those issues are like that. And there are some that are just not. We've dealt with severe bullying issues and the only way the school found out about them was through Pulse. Like the student who reached out in Pulse while he was being bullied on the bus, which was the place that he got bullied. We've had students reach out around coercive control during the COVID lockdowns and the parents monitoring all of their behavior. And the school used to be the place that they would go to get a break and that was gone. And those things I wasn't ready for. And I'm really grateful that I've got a super supportive family to help me go through some of these things. And that's just vicarious. So I already love what educators do. And this is just the journey of Pulse for me personally has been really powerful. But it's not all about those sorts of interactions. On the other side of the scale, we've had of the order of 750,000 students reach out to say thank you. Just to say thank you to their friends, to say thank you to their teachers about the things that have made life a difference. At the end of a check-in, they get this opportunity to say, hey, I'd like to say, they can type in any name in the school. I just want to send a little thank you to those students. And if you want to know what they're happy about, overwhelmingly, they say thank you for being kind. And if that, whereas I found, earlier stuff really a challenging emotional journey, this fills my heart with joy. The fact that kindness is the top thing that gets said thank you for, it just makes me really happy. Lastly, that we've delivered we're approaching 8 million data points to schools across about 200 schools across about 16 countries. So we've delivered data to schools that they've been able to act on. And I want to close out this last little bit with just some of the things they've done. So the first is at a boarding school, and this is going to, I guess, come back to what Adam was saying about you don't know until you measure. At a boarding school where a very small number of the students were having breakfast. And when the staff found out the data, they sat down and they said, well, it could be body image issues, it could be eating disorders, it could be peer pressure, it could be any number of things. But they did the only sensible thing to do, which was they asked the students, what's going on? Turns out that sports training finished a little bit too close to the start of school and people just didn't have time for breakfast. So that school shifted sports training by 20 minutes and completely changed the number of students who went to school hungry, right? So they didn't even know to have that conversation. But they had the conversation, it confounded their expectations and they made a small change. At another school, that played out totally differently. They asked the same questions, they got the same results. There were a bunch of students who weren't having breakfast, but this was a very different kind of school. This was a school from a different kind of socioeconomic background. And what was happening is that kids just did not have access to breakfast, period. Not all the students, obviously, but a cohort of students. And they did such a wonderful thing. So they started a before school thing called Breakfast Club. And it was badged as if you would like to come to school early and catch up with your friends, we think that's a great opportunity for social bonding. And by the way, we'll provide breakfast. And so they completely avoided the stigma that might be associated with not being able to get breakfast. And they changed the nature of how hungry they were when they were going to school. It was phenomenal. The last thing I want to talk about is a story. It was from an international school, but I know I've heard these. This school in particular was an international school, but I've heard similar stories. So, you know, many schools obviously have the school captains, and then they'll have the house captains, and they'll have the sports captains, and maybe they'll have music and drama captains. Well, this school decided we're getting a lot of value out of the pulse data. We're going to have wellbeing captains. And so when the school runs an initiative based on the data, the first thing they do is talk to the wellbeing captains, and the students deliver many of those initiatives, and not just easy ones as well. They've had student-led discussions on gender and inequality and access to services and all sorts of things, but the students really want to be a part of this conversation. And so, as I say, the schools are doing the sorts of things that they didn't really have the data to support them doing in the past. If you think about an annual survey, you get the data once a year, you're going to have annual initiatives, and they've got to be big. Putting on breakfast is not big enough. Having a conversation about gender is not big enough, but they're vitally important. And because they center the conversation at the school regularly, it makes a massive difference to the culture at the school. And that's what I'm talking about small steps, about steps that are supported by data and steps that are supported by tooling. So that's where we've got to. And I'm just so proud of what we've done. I really am super proud. Now,
sorry, I got so lost in your presentation, I forgot I was presenting. Is it my turn?
It is your turn.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just looking at time, and I'm just, look, one of the things, how I want to finish is just talk about the possibility for change. I mean, Joe, obviously you've given some great outcomes there. So to kind of counteract my doom and gloom start about how challenging things are for educators, let's look at how capable of change they are. So one of the things we do with Flourish is we also want to inspire other wellbeing programs to just have more rigor around measurement and understanding, do things change and why do they change? So some of the things we've seen with Flourish for Schools is that dramatic increases in trust of leader. And the reason trust of leader goes up so much is because the leaders are having those wellbeing conversations. They're having conversations about, you know, interruptions and how we work. They're having conversations about meaning and purpose, and also how people deal with challenging things. It just builds that connection. And obviously we've seen dramatic improvements in how supportive they feel that their team is. And one of the reasons why this goes up so much is that because you do it as a whole school, or if you're a very large school, you might do it in smaller chunks and smaller groups. Because you're talking about your action plans and holding each other accountable and supporting others in their action plans, you feel that peer support to make these changes. So overall, culture really improves as well. Now, in terms of some of the results of the Flourish movement, which is the leadership program, what we've seen, and this comes from that second focus around reducing the chaos, we've seen massive reductions in number of interruptions that they experience in a day. So they're more focused, they're controlling their environment better, they're putting boundaries in place. What this leads to is the ability to spend time in areas that, number one, really light them up and that they love, and number two, that actually make a real impact on the school. The other thing that we see is dramatic improvements in balance. So that second score there, 91% increase in boundary strength, is just the ability to disconnect from work and go home and be present and not ruminate and worry. Recovery behaviors, those bottom two, is that they're starting to do things for themselves, where they are either at work or outside of work are doing self-care activities. So we've seen significant shifts in that. What we also see is that stress declines, energy levels go up, And these results have been consistent throughout COVID as well, where even though it's incredibly challenging and the role has changed so much because of it, we're still seeing these improvements. Not that you needed it, but resilience goes up, optimism, positivity at work. What our data shows is that when you invest in educators and when you give them time and space, and when you give them permission to do these things, they are extraordinary at changing their behavior. We do a lot of work in the corporate world, and some of the corporate programs we run get good results, but not nearly as strong as what Flourish does. Educators are very good at taking on learning and implementing it. And one of the biggest things is that we've seen massive drops in considering leaving the job. I mean, depending on which area you were in, but teacher shortages and shortages around school leaders varies. But I mean, this is an issue we're facing into the future and will continue to face. And this drop is a really encouraging one. So they're more likely to stay in the role. What we also did, and I'll finish on this one, is just, as I said before, what we're trying to do is raise the level of rigor around measurement of wellbeing programs. So what we got Deakin University to do was study the people that finished the program between 1 and 5 years ago to see had the habit stuck. And what we showed is that almost 60% of people are still in high implementation. Those action plans and the behaviors that they've implemented have stuck. 30% are in medium implementation and 10% are in low. So that low group has really dropped off the bandwagon and have lost some of the behaviors that they've gained in that program. But like close to 90% are still doing a lot of the program. Now, what was really interesting is that since they finished, the high implementers, many of the constructs we measure have compounded, like they've continued to actually get better. And what was fascinating is even the low implementation group are still better off than when they started the program on all measures. So what we're seeing is that investing in educators around wellbeing is a really good investment because it sticks, they keep doing it, and it has tangible outcomes on their ability to do the role. So actually, the last thing I will say is one thing we've just done is hired the people, what do you call them, Joe? Actuaries who measure return on investment. So large health funds hire actuaries to measure what sort of return on investment do we get if we invest in something. We've used that same group to measure the return on investment from Flourish. And what we've shown is it's a 300% return. So for every dollar that's invested in them doing the program, they get a 300% return each year around that investment. So what we're learning is that you guys, investing in your well-being is a really great strategy because you make changes and those changes stick. So there's some of the results. There's the happy conclusion to my earlier start. But we could possibly do questions. I don't know, Joe, if obviously we're going to talk about what we could do together moving forward, but I suppose, Lauren, are there any questions that have come up in the Q&A? I haven't had time to look. Or does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, no, we haven't had any questions. I'm willing to give it a go to try and, spotlight someone. So if you want to pop your hand up, if you do have a question for Adam and Joe, I can let you talk. Anyone want to pop their hand up? We can do it that way.
Should have got them to use Pulse so they feel safer to ask.
Yes. I'm so pleased. Here's a question from Anne. I'm so pleased that you had a positive end there, Adam.
Well, I mean, as I said before, it's extraordinary the level of change that we've seen. And a lot of that is to do with the group cohesion and support and giving each other permission. Actually, Jane Danvers has asked a question in the chat.
We've got Anne first there. Anne, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Lauren. Hi, Adam and Joe. Apologies. I missed the first few minutes of the session. Is there like an ideal number of staff that would take place in the Flourish program?
What we encourage is that all staff do it.
Right.
One of the biggest pieces of feedback we've got, and what we do is get one of the leaders to facilitate them through the program. So it's online. You basically put it up on the screen, you press play when it tells you to. All the videos instruct you, stop it now, have this conversation, fill this out. So there's no prep. But the biggest pieces of feedback we've got is admin staff said it was so great to participate in that. They said sometimes some of the PD we don't get to join, and us being included in that really helped build connection with other people in the school. It shows that you really appreciate us. So my advice would be getting everyone to do it, or we have had some really big schools go, actually, we're going to break it into 5 groups and they go through it together. But this is not a program where you go, oh, we've got this online program, go home and do this module. It's no, the key is having these conversations, going through it together, creating those buddies. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question. Does that answer it?
Yes, thank you. And sorry, when you said the leaders sort of run it, you mean the school leaders from the from the school, right? Okay.
Yeah. So you might nominate. So we're talking to a really large girls' school in Sydney, and they've just appointed a new head of learning, and he's 4 weeks into the role, and he said, I see this as a great way to start making myself visible. People get to know me. So we work with him to bring him up to speed, and he's running that. And they've broken it into 3 groups because they're such a big school.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Jane. Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah. Hey, Jane.
Hi, how are you? No, I was just wondering, Lauren, it might just in terms of principals, if there was interest from principals, would the Alliance put together a group for him?
Yeah, most certainly we'd be interested in doing that, Jane. Well, nice to hear you. Can't see you, but lovely to hear you. And I hope that Sydney's working out well for you. I don't know, Adam, Joe, we could do something along those lines, couldn't we, with an Alliance group?
Yeah, we're very keen to do that. I mean, one of our biggest interests in working with you guys is that you have that great support structure. You already work together and support each other. And, you know, if we're starting from that high base, I'm super interested in what we can achieve. So this is something we're going to put out expressions of interest for, to put a group together. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Stay tuned, Jane, I think, and everyone else. Any other questions there? I don't think so, Adam and Joe. So anything you want to say in closing?
No, just thank you so much for letting us come along and present. Joe, I kind of, as I said before, I got lost in your presentation. I just find the stuff about making it safe, psychological safety is a huge concept in business right now. The nudging, making it easy. Like we often forget, like, are there barriers to entry? So I suppose I found it very interesting, Joe.
I'm glad. And yeah, I guess the only thing I'd lead on is one of the big part of the reason we're presenting together is we've obviously worked together for a long time. But what we've not found in the past necessarily is what's the dynamic of the programs working together. Yeah. And one of the things that we would find super interesting, to the point where we'll definitely run research off the back of it, is finding a pilot group of schools who would like to run both programs and would like to spend that little bit of extra time talking to us about how they're both working together and really shape it. When we launched Pulse in particular, there were 3 or 4 Alliance schools who were instrumental in turning it from what it started as to turning it into what it is today. And I'd love to go through that journey again.
Yeah.
And making sure that, you know, whole school wellbeing is so often written off, so often characterized as everybody, the whole school looks after the students, but it's not that. It's really about the whole school having support structures for each other. And so things like Flourish and the Flourish movement, Staff Pulse and Student Pulse, they're parts of a bigger picture. And we want to really make sure that we're building that picture as strongly as possible. And I honestly, and I said this line beforehand, I can't think of a better place to go and find the schools who would be involved in that than the Alliance, because our experience over lots of years has been that you're early adopters in this stuff.
Yeah, Joe, and I think what you described then is the educated default of how do I serve the students more. And what we've got to also look at is, we want to do that, but also how do we serve each other and how do I serve myself? Yeah, and as just to reiterate, I mean, obviously we could give you some really fascinating data at baseline about how you compare to other schools and areas, but also that longitudinal data about the changes that occur within a group like this.
I think that is just super exciting. So we will get something out to everyone who's been in this session on an expression of interest of getting involved in a combined Flourish Pulse initiative for the Alliance. That would be amazing.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having us.
Oh, thank you so much for being part of today and for everything that that you're both doing to support our schools and our staff and our students. You know, it's great, and we'll get the recording of today out. We'll get a feedback questionnaire out, and we'll also get out some info about that initiative. So I guess that wraps up today. Thank you so much for joining us, and huge thanks, Joe and Adam.